What if, on an ordinary afternoon, everything you cherished disappeared in a moment, and the only witness was a dog who refused to forget? In a quiet Montana town, two young sisters vanished without a trace, leaving their mother, a silent K9, and a whole neighborhood forever changed. Years slipped by with no answers, only the patient vigil of an old German shepherd who never stopped searching the shadows. If someone you loved was lost, how long would you keep hoping? What would you risk to bring them home? Share your story or your hope in the comments below. Autumn in Missoula arrived not with a shout but a hush, a slow folding of gold into the cottonwoods. The sun caught in tangled branches, the air thinned and laced with wood smoke. On Rosewood Court, you could almost believe time had slowed for the sake of the light, for the low chimneys, for the laughter of children drifting across brittle lawns. The wind, mild but persistent, teased loose 1,000 yellow leaves, sending them skittering across sidewalks chalked with rainbows and hopscotch. Inside one old bungalow, the day had the texture of ritual. Allison Reed, thin-shouldered, hair pinned back in a way that meant she was tired, moved through the kitchen with a soft focus. She measured rice, set water to boil, wiped her hands on a towel that had belonged to her late husband. Outside the window, her daughters traced swirling pastel galaxies on the concrete. Hazel, 6, crouched in deep concentration, sketching the tail of a blue fox. June, 4, darted around her sister, toes wet with dew, cheeks flushed with the last warmth of October. Beneath the eaves, on the cool slate of the porch, Miles Rowan sat with a stack of unsorted mail. The badge clipped to his jeans glinted in the afternoon sun, but it was the scar, a pale, jagged seam across his right palm, that betrayed where he held his tension. At his feet, Bishop, a German shepherd with the look of rain clouds in his fur and a slight nick behind one ear, lay stretched out in the warmth. The dog's eyes were half closed, but never still. Every so often, his nose lifted to the breeze, as if reading a secret only he could decipher. The world here ran on small rituals. Supper started before dusk. Porch lights clicked on as shadows lengthened. Children called inside with the first sign of cold. There was a comfort in the repetition, a sense of safety built from 1,000 days just like this one. Miles sipped coffee grown cold, tracking the movements of the girls, the slow drift of clouds, the patience in Bishop's stillness. Sometimes, he wondered how many ordinary afternoons he'd overlooked before his life became a ledger of what-ifs. A jay shrieked from the pine. The sound startled June, who abandoned her chalk to chase a leaf tumbling along the curb. Hazel called after her softly. No alarm. Just the certainty that June always returned. The swing set, old and crooked, shivered in the wind. Bishop's ears flicked up, then settled again. The world seemed suspended between heartbeat and hush. It was then that Allison's phone rang, a chime too loud in the quiet. She glanced through the window, eyes soft on her daughters, then vanished inside. The call was from her sister, a world away in Portland, a voice that carried news and sorrow. Allison pressed the phone to her ear, answered in gentle fragments, her attention half anchored to the warmth rising from the stove. Minutes, the kind that pass uncounted, too slight to weigh, slipped by. The house seemed to deepen in silence, the afternoon thickening at the edges. On the porch, Miles realized he hadn't heard June's laughter in a while. He set down the mug, its ring left on the rail, and stood. Bishop shifted, following the gaze, alert without agitation. The wind pushed a paper cup across the sidewalk. The swings creaked, but no small hands gripped their ropes. A half-finished fox glowed blue against the fading light, unguarded. Hazel's sneakers, one bright pink, one white, were lined up neatly near the porch step. June's purple scarf dangled from the fence, trembling like a caught wish. Miles stepped onto the lawn, voice low, calling names without urgency, just the tone of a man sure children are always near. Bishop sniffed the air, body tense, tail stiffening as he moved with cautious purpose to the corner of the yard, nose to ground. Inside, Allison hung up, lingered for a moment in the soft afterglow of voices from far away. When she stepped outside, the yard looked unchanged, yet there was a strange hollowness. The chalk drawings undisturbed, the swing still in motion. The sudden absence pressed against her chest, an ache before understanding. She called, once, then again. The wind carried her words away. In the brief confusion that follows loss, there is denial, the mind grasping at the smallest hope. Hazel and June must be just around the side of the house, collecting pine cones, chasing a stray cat. Perhaps they wandered to the neighbors, the friendly widow who let them pick tomatoes in summer. Bishop trotted to the end of the alley, halted, looked back, eyes deep, questioning. Miles felt the hush settle, a silence too thick for a place so small. The minutes grew heavy. Allison's voice rose in pitch, then cracked. A slipper turned up beneath the hydrangea, the empty porch, the cold ring of the phone. Miles felt the familiar pull of panic, a memory from old winters, from calls gone wrong. He searched for signs, bent grass, smudged footprints in soft earth, but the world held its secrets. Bishop stood unmoving, body braced, gaze fixed on the end of the lane where wild grass swallowed the last warmth of day. Neighbors arrived, called out, checked behind garages, peeked beneath parked cars. Doors slammed open, footsteps hurried. Yet through it all, there was a sense of something quietly, terribly wrong. The sun slipped lower. Porch lights flickered on, uncertain. The old rituals held no comfort now. In the hush that followed, Bishop circled once, sat, and waited. Sometimes, the ones who feel the break in the world aren't those who speak the loudest, but those who listen the longest. Miles knelt beside the dog, hand resting gently on his back. Bishop did not move, his breath slow, steady, patient as dusk. Far off, the river moved as it always did, indifferent and constant. The air was thick with wood smoke and the scent of coming rain. Somewhere in Missoula, someone began to pray. And just like that, peace fractured, not with a scream but with silence. Night pressed in on Rosewood Court before anyone realized just how quickly the shadows could gather. At first, there was only confusion, innocent, almost casual. Allison called again, her voice searching for the familiar. "Hazel! June!" It was the tone reserved for bath times, for dinner warnings. There was a hope, too, in the way she lingered on the last syllable, as if stretching the name could pull her daughters back from wherever they'd slipped away. But dusk fell swiftly. The neighborhood, so often a cradle for idle play, now bristled with a quiet, purposeful movement. Doors opened, feet scuffed over gravel and fallen leaves, and the calm routine was replaced by something urgent yet wordless. People gathered without thinking, old men in work boots, mothers with towels still thrown over wet hair, a teenager in a football jersey. Nobody asked for help. The old code of small towns had already activated. When a child is missing, everyone becomes kin. Miles moved through it all with a soldier's focus, methodical and outwardly calm. He noticed the sharpness in Allison's hands, the way she clutched Hazel's little sweater, her thumb moving back and forth across the fabric, desperate for any trace. He catalogued every footprint, every broken stem, every bit of upturned earth, his mind looping through what-ifs and what must be done. His own voice, rarely loud, grew softer still. He called the names once, then again, letting the silence swallow the syllables. Bishop wove among the searchers, his movement patient and precise. He paused at the chalk drawings, nose brushing against the blue fox, then moved on to the swing, sniffing at the chains, at the spot beneath where June's shoes had pressed the dirt. Bishop's ears flicked, his breath visible in the cold air, and then he circled the perimeter of the yard, slow and thorough. Every so often, he'd pause and look back at Miles, as if to ask, "What is missing? Where did they go?" The dog's discipline was a thing learned and earned, nothing frantic, only the deep, relentless focus of a creature whose whole life is built on finding what others miss. Neighbors fanned out along the street, flashlights trembling in uncertain hands. They searched the bushes beside the fences, checked under porches, called out into the darkening spaces between houses. A boy on a bicycle pedaled the alley, eyes wide and scared, searching for signs, a forgotten toy, a scrap of fabric, the echo of a voice. Behind every hedge, hope flickered and faded. Allison stood still in the yard. She seemed to have rooted herself to the ground, her eyes fixed on the gate at the end of the fence, her lips pressed into a line so thin it could cut. In her hands, Hazel's pink sweater. On the porch steps, June's sandals, still damp with dew, one fallen sideways. The world seemed to conspire in its indifference. The wind rose, scattering leaves in sudden, desperate flurries. A single porch light flickered on, then another. Soon, the entire block was illuminated by these quiet beacons, house after house glowing in silent solidarity. No one said it, but everyone knew. Lights meant hope. They meant someone was watching. Still, no sound returned from the darkness. Miles moved through yards he'd never entered before, nodded to men he'd only seen across crowded supermarkets. He checked fences, rattled locked gates, peered into gardens overrun with summer's leftovers. Behind one garage, Bishop hesitated, nose pressed to the earth, tail stiff. Miles crouched beside him, hand pressed gently to the dog's ribs, feeling the deep, steady breath. For a moment, he listened, really listened, to the silence, searching for the world underneath the noise. Somewhere, a radio played a ball game, the announcer's voice tinny and bright. In another house, the smell of baking drifted out, cinnamon, apples, the comforts of routine. But here, at the border between what was safe and what was lost, the air felt heavy, expectant. Bishop's head snapped up. He stared into the darkness at the edge of the woods, then sat, refusing to move. Sometimes, the right path is only visible to those who refuse to leave their post. The official search began before midnight. Patrol cars crawled the neighborhood with lights dimmed low, more for comfort than for any hope of finding answers in the beam. Volunteers combed the trails along the river, voices calling into the thickening fog. A woman from 3 houses down brought thermoses of coffee, her hands shaking as she poured. An elderly man, cane forgotten at his side, paced the curb for hours, eyes fixed on the street lamp, as if it might reveal a secret. No one asked how this could happen. Not yet. That question comes later, when hope has worn itself thin. For now, the street operated by instinct, by the old, unspoken bonds that hold people together in the absence of explanation. Bishop never left the fence line. He traced the same patch of earth again and again, then finally sat, nose pressed to the wooden slats, eyes steady on the emptiness beyond. Miles lingered nearby, not daring to call him away. Sometimes healing comes not from the frantic search, but from the willingness to remain in the place where pain first arrived. Inside, Allison sat on the edge of Hazel's bed. She held the small pink sweater to her chest, rocking gently, her eyes fixed on the window, on the darkness beyond. On the nightstand, a photo. Two girls, cheeks flushed with laughter, arms wrapped around Bishop's shaggy neck. The lamp cast a soft circle of light, but beyond it, the house was still, waiting for morning. Somewhere in the branches, a barn owl called, a sound so ancient and mournful it seemed to vibrate with every missing child the town had ever known. And when the world went finally, truly quiet, Bishop lifted his head, nose pointed into the night, and listened, patient, enduring, refusing to forget. Time has a way of softening tragedy, sanding down its sharpest corners, but the shape of the loss remains, recognizable to those who lived it. In the days and weeks after Hazel and June vanished, Rosewood Court existed in a half-light, a place where routine continued, but joy never quite returned. Autumn ran its course, gold leaves giving way to brittle brown, the world moving on as if forgetting was the only way to survive. The first week was a tangle of frantic hope and exhaustion. Miles found himself walking the same narrow stretch behind the houses each morning, boots damp with dew, Bishop at his side. Together, they combed the underbrush, checked the edges of the river, followed game trails into the pines. Each time they returned empty-handed. Still, every day began with the same ritual: leash, boots, flashlight, the silent agreement between man and dog that today maybe would be different. Flyers bloomed on every pole and lamppost, Hazel and June's faces side by side, the photos already too young, too bright. Allison replaced them daily at first, each time smoothing the corners with careful hands. But after a month of rain and wind, most posters hung in tatters, their edges curling, colors faded to pale ghosts. Sometimes the wind would tear one free and send it tumbling down the street, coming to rest in a storm drain, a gutter, or caught against Bishop's paws as he waited by the fence. The world shrank to small, stubborn rituals, Allison making breakfast for one, then for none. Miles scanning through missing person databases late into the night, chasing leads that dissolved into nothing. The neighbors, once quick with a wave or a casserole, grew quieter, their eyes sliding away at the mailbox, uncertain how to greet a grief that had lingered too long. Bishop became a fixture at the corner of the yard, always alert, always waiting. The grass grew thin where he circled, a soft depression forming, a record of patience written into the earth itself. He did not whine, did not demand. His loyalty was silent, absolute. Sometimes, on cold mornings, Allison would bring out half a sandwich and sit beside him, offering bites in silence. She didn't speak, nor did he move closer. Their companionship was a quiet truce, two beings holding vigil for the same loss. Hazel's room remained untouched. Stuffed animals lined the bed, a menagerie of mute witnesses. June's drawings, colored in bold streaks of blue and yellow, still hung on the fridge, curling at the corners. Allison vacuumed the carpets, dusted the shelves, set out clean clothes as if at any moment the girls might come running home. Socks muddied, hair tangled, cheeks flushed with the thrill of escape. But each night she turned off the lights in an empty house, the hope a little fainter, the silence a little heavier. Miles lost himself in the paperwork, in the endless, looping analysis that comes when answers refuse to surface. He kept a notebook by his bed, pages filled with questions, maps, fragments of memory, a missing shoe print by the river, a scrap of purple ribbon snagged on a bush. Sometimes he would run his thumb along the scar on his palm, a grounding ritual, a reminder that wounds heal but they never truly disappear. He tried not to think of the families he'd watched fracture, the holes left in their lives when the world failed to answer. Through it all, Bishop held his post. He slept by the door, waiting for a voice, a footstep, any sign of return. On days when the wind shifted, he'd bristle and look toward the woods, ears cocked, nose working the air. Miles watched the dog as much as the evidence, trusting his instincts when his own hope faltered. There were days when it seemed Bishop alone remembered why they waited. His presence reminded Miles that faith was sometimes simply the refusal to give up, to sit with the ache even when the world had moved on. Life on Rosewood Court adapted to the new silence. Halloween came and went, porches unlit, jack-o'-lanterns left uncarved. Winter crept down from the hills, frosting windows, blanketing the yard in white. The neighbors spoke less, eyes wary, children kept close indoors. Even the air felt changed, as if mourning too. Miles, never one for prayer, found himself muttering hopes into the darkness, half-formed promises that tomorrow some scrap of truth would reveal itself. Bishop, aging faster now, still insisted on his evening watch, his nose pressed to the same fence slat, eyes searching the same empty lane. When Miles joined him, there was comfort in the shared ritual, in the endurance of waiting. As the seasons circled, grief softened but never left. Every birthday that passed was a knife turned slowly. Allison marked them with a single candle, sometimes lighting it, sometimes just setting it on the sill. The neighbors learned not to ask if she needed anything. They left casseroles on the step, sent cards on holidays, but never pressed for conversation. Sometimes a child's laughter would drift in from the next block, too bright and sharp for comfort, and doors would quietly close against the sound. Bishop grew gray around the muzzle, movements slower, but his posture never slouched. Each evening, he sat in the fading light, eyes fixed on the place where the girls had last been seen. To the world, it was only a patch of grass at the edge of a quiet neighborhood. To Bishop and to Miles, it was still a center of every hope that remained. And so the waiting became their way of loving. The search became their prayer. The ache of what was missing did not vanish. It became the shape of their days, etched into the rhythm of footsteps, the hush of twilight, the silent companionship of man and dog beneath the vast Montana sky. 4 years passed, not all at once, but in small, almost unnoticeable increments, the way winter loses its grip on the earth, one patch of thawed ground at a time. In Rosewood Court, the passage of time settled like a hush over the neighborhood, muffling laughter, pressing down on old traditions until they vanished altogether. The day Hazel and June disappeared became a wound so deep, so private, that people stopped speaking of it, not because they didn't remember, but because remembering hurt too much. The street changed, slowly. Once, children played kickball in the afternoons, chased each other down the sidewalk, shouted over the clang of dinner bells. Now, most front yards sat empty, swing sets grown rusty and stiff. Porch lights clicked on before sunset, their glow a silent reminder to stay close to home. Halloween decorations stayed boxed in basements. Birthday parties were kept small, invitations never posted on telephone poles. It wasn't fear, exactly, but a wariness, a recognition that bad things could happen in good places. For Allison, life divided into before and after. She returned to work, her classroom quieter, her eyes carrying a gravity that small children couldn't quite name but seemed to understand. She taught songs with gentler melodies, chose stories that spoke softly of hope and healing. The old playfulness was there, sometimes, in the way she traced a child's hand for an art project, or paused to tie a shoelace with extra care. But in the quiet moments, when the room emptied, when the sun slanted through the blinds, her hands would drift to her necklace, fingers rubbing the tiny silver charms etched with her daughter's initials. No one asked why she wore them every day. The answer was already written in the set of her jaw. Miles felt the years differently. The weight of unsolved cases left lines across his brow, a heaviness in his step that had not been there before. His work grew quieter, more solitary. He took extra shifts, patrolled Rosewood Court more often than duty required. At night, he sifted through the case files again and again, tracing timelines and revisiting interviews. He learned the patterns of the neighborhood like the lines on his palm, the new locks on doors, the way curtains twitched when headlights passed, the slow fading of the chalk marks Hazel and June had once drawn along the curb. He also watched Bishop age. The German shepherd moved slower now, careful with each step. The fur at his muzzle had whitened, his gaze a little cloudier. Yet every evening, without fail, Bishop would walk to the front door and sit, waiting for Miles to grab his jacket and leash. They'd walk the familiar circuit, past Allison's house, through the side street lined with crabapple trees, down the gravel alley where Hazel once found a wounded bird. Sometimes, Bishop would stop and stare at the house next door, Arthur Kellogg's place. The old man's windows stayed shuttered, his mailbox overflowed with circulars. People whispered that Arthur had grown even more withdrawn since the girls disappeared, rarely leaving except to fetch groceries, always returning with his head down. Miles had never trusted easy answers, and he knew better than to assign blame without proof, but in the slow circling of years, he noticed the patterns, the way Arthur avoided eye contact, how he seemed to flinch when children's voices carried on the breeze. There were stories, of course, Arthur's odd hours, his radio static drifting through the night, the way he sometimes spoke to himself on his porch. But Rosewood Court had learned to keep its judgments quiet, locking them away behind the same doors that had once stood open. Still, Bishop never failed to pause outside Arthur's gate, nostrils flaring, ears tipped forward. Some evenings he'd linger long after Miles was ready to move on, as if waiting for a sign, or remembering something he couldn't quite explain. Miles respected the dog's instincts, sometimes more than he trusted his own. In a world made unreliable by grief, Bishop's silent vigil offered a kind of hope, a reminder that faith could live on in the smallest, most persistent acts. Inside the houses, life tried to root itself again. Lawns were mowed, gardens tended, Allison planted sunflowers one spring, tall, golden faces rising above the fence, a promise that something beautiful could grow in even the hardest ground. The neighbors nodded to one another at the mailbox, but conversation never lingered. In place of laughter, there was a kind of tender caution. People watched over each other's children, double-checked the locks at dusk, counted heads at every barbecue. The physical reminders of loss faded, but its shadow lingered in habits, windows locked, porches lit, eyes wary. Some nights, Miles would find himself awake before dawn, tracing the old walking route in his mind, wondering if he'd missed something all those years ago. Bishop, sensitive to his moods, would rise from his bed and nudge Miles's knee, the warmth of his breath a steadying presence. Arthur Kellogg, for his part, seemed content to remain a mystery. His lawn grew wild, dandelions crowding the path to his door. Occasionally, the faint strains of a radio broadcast would drift through his open window, old blues crackling with static, songs that sounded like they belonged to another century. If he noticed the way Bishop watched him, he never let on. And so the days lengthened and shortened, the seasons spun. Under the hush of ordinary routines, grief became a companion, softened only by time, memory, and the small, faithful acts that marked the passage from one day to the next. Miles learned that not every question had an answer, that not every pain could be spoken. But in Bishop's silent watchfulness, in the way the dog refused to give up his vigil outside Arthur's home, there was something like grace, a quiet insistence that what is lost may still be found, if only you are willing to keep listening. One evening in late September, as the sky faded from blue to indigo, Miles sat on the porch steps, Bishop pressed close against his side. The air was sharp with the promise of coming cold, the first leaves beginning to fall. Allison's house was dark, but a single sunflower still stood by the fence, its head bowed. Across the street, Arthur's window glowed blue with television light. Nothing moved but the wind and the quiet breathing of an old dog who, even after all these years, still believed in miracles. It was early winter, the kind of night when the air in Missoula turned wet and electric, the clouds low enough to erase the mountain peaks from the edges of the sky. Rain fell with a soft persistence, drawing streams down the window glass and deepening every shadow. On Rosewood Court, Christmas lights were strung across eaves and bare-limbed maples, but their cheer was muffled, colors bleeding together in the drizzle. Miles Rowan's patrol was nearly done, his boots soaked through and his collar turned up against the wind. Rain stitched dark threads through his hair, plastered his shirt to his spine. It had been a long shift, uneventful, save for a handful of petty calls and a fox darting across the road near the bridge. He'd grown used to this muted rhythm, checking corners, glancing up at curtained windows, nodding to late-night dog walkers hurrying home. Yet as he reached the bend where Rosewood Court dead-ended at the stand of pines, he felt the old tension settle across his shoulders, the unshakable sense that not all was well in the quiet heart of his neighborhood. Bishop padded beside him, slower than in years past, but no less attentive, his fur darkened by rain, paws leaving muddy crescents in the thin grass. The dog's gaze, steady and unhurried, swept the edges of the block. Bishop paused now and then, nose lifted to catch scents on the wind. Wood smoke, wet earth, the faint metallic tang of snow coming. It was then, passing Arthur Kellogg's house, that something shifted. Bishop stopped short at the corner of the old iron fence, fur along his shoulders rising in a ripple. Ears pricked forward, He let out a low, throaty whine, a sound Miles hadn't heard in months. The street was empty. Arthur's windows were dark, shades drawn tight, and yet there was a presence in the air, a feeling of being watched. Miles stopped, alert but cautious, hand drifting to his flashlight. Bishop took a tentative step forward, head low, body tense as a drawn bow. Miles followed the line of the dog's attention, scanning the puddled curb, the long shadows thrown by a single porch light flickering behind wet glass. Then, through the rain, a sound. It was nothing at first, just a barely there whimper, almost like the wind catching in a pipe. But as the hush settled around them, Miles heard it again. A thin, muffled cry, the kind of sound that might have been a stray cat or the moan of an old hinge, but something in it stilled him. He stood, listening, holding his breath until every muscle in his body hummed with focus. Bishop lunged, paws scrabbling at the base of the fence. He barked, sharp and insistent, claws digging into the softened ground. Mud splashed up onto Miles's jeans as he knelt beside the dog, heart pounding not with fear, but with the ancient urgency that attends the possibility of discovery. The rain seemed to fall harder, masking other sounds, but Bishop would not be distracted. He dug with frantic purpose, nose pressed to the earth, chest heaving. Across the narrow yard, a light flicked on. Arthur Kellogg's figure appeared in the window, his face pale in the glow, mouth set in a hard, unreadable line. For a long moment, he did not move, only stared out, his eyes darting from Miles to Bishop and back. His hands gripped the curtain, knuckles white against the fabric. The radio on Arthur's kitchen table played something old, strings and static, the melody lost behind the storm. Miles met the old man's gaze but said nothing, unwilling to break the delicate silence between them. Instead, he bent lower, pushing aside dead leaves and tangled grass. Bishop pressed forward, whining deep in his throat, paws now muddy and trembling. The sound came again, clearer now. A faint, almost desperate call, cut short as if smothered by fear or by walls too thick to breach. Miles's breath caught in his chest. For a second, the world narrowed. Just the rain, the dog, the old man watching, and that sound, so easily missed, so easily dismissed. From inside their homes, neighbors stirred. Lights blinked on across the street. Faces appeared at windows, worry growing in the hush. A woman in a housecoat pulled her blinds aside, frowning at the scene. No one came out, but the neighborhood seemed to lean closer, holding its collective breath. Bishop barked once more, not loud but piercing, a call that echoed through the cold and the rain. Miles rose, hands slick with mud, and shined his flashlight along the fence line, up the cracked foundation of Arthur's house, toward the basement window just above the flower bed. A window Miles realized now he had never seen open. Arthur disappeared from view, curtains dropping back into place. The radio's music faded to silence. Only the rain, insistent and ceaseless, filled the gap. Miles stood motionless for a moment, letting the storm soak through his uniform, the ache in his bones returning. Bishop sat at his feet, head bowed, the tip of his tail dragging small circles in the mud. It was as if the world had tilted slightly, every shadow suddenly deeper, every sound charged with meaning. When Miles finally led Bishop away, he cast a last look at Arthur's house, memorizing every detail, the wild tangle of the garden, the shape of footprints near the window, the way Bishop lingered, nose pressed to the ground, unwilling to move. Back at his own porch, Miles stood beneath the eaves, rain streaming down in sheets, and looked out over the darkened street. In the glow of the distant porch lights, he saw Bishop, still, silent, alert, watching the place where the sound had come and gone, his faith in the invisible undiminished. Inside, Miles took off his boots, water pooling at his feet. He listened to the quiet of the house, the slow tick of the clock, the memory of that cry lingering at the edges of his thoughts. Some nights, a mystery returns like a wound opening under old weather. On those nights, hope is not the absence of fear, but the stubbornness to listen again and again, for a sound only the faithful will hear. And somewhere in the dark, Bishop waited, body curled tight, nose twitching at dreams, ready to lead the way if only someone would follow. The rain didn't let up for days. It settled in, a gray, persistent presence, pressing low over Missoula, making the river rise and the streets shine like ink. Miles found sleep elusive. When it came, it was shallow and filled with restless half-dreams, fragments of chalk drawings, distant voices muffled by water, Bishop's insistent bark echoing again and again, just beyond waking. Morning bled into afternoon without promise. Coffee left cold on the kitchen counter, a notepad filling with scribbles and half-formed questions. Miles stood at the window, watching Bishop move through the yard, nose low to the soggy ground, every step careful, deliberate. There was a purpose in the dog's every movement, a thread tying him to some truth the world refused to speak. It was Bishop who first drew Miles back toward Arthur Kellogg's place. The dog paced by the gate, staring down the overgrown path that led to the side of the house, tail stiff, eyes trained on the place where, just nights before, that cry had slipped through the rain. Miles knew the neighborhood by heart, the sagging porch, the tangled wildflowers gone brittle with frost, the faded address numbers nailed crooked above the door. But he had never really studied Arthur's house, not with the same quiet urgency as now. He left his cruiser parked 2 blocks away, not wanting to announce himself or stir suspicion. The morning was cold, the sky mottled with clouds, sun threatening to break through but never quite arriving. Bishop moved ahead, nose to earth, weaving through the shadows, pausing at every odd scent. Near the base of the foundation, just beneath the basement window, the dog stopped. He pressed his muzzle to a patch of freshly turned earth, paws digging softly at the damp soil. Miles crouched beside him, fingertips brushing the uneven ground. The mud was loose, darker than the rest, as if something had been buried and quickly covered again. He found a broken bit of plastic, a toy figurine, worn smooth by time, its colors faded to a dull whisper of blue. Bishop whined, nudging the dirt until another small object surfaced, the corner of a page from a children's book, water-stained but unmistakable. The world seemed to slow, the air thick with memory. Miles's mind cycled back. Hazel's favorite book, June's habit of carrying little treasures in her pockets, the ordinary magic of childhood made haunting by absence. He pocketed the items, heart tight in his chest, then stood, scanning the rest of the yard. At the cellar door, Bishop pawed at the threshold, nose working the seam where wood met stone. The hinges bore the marks of recent use, scrapes shiny against the dullness of old paint. There was a faint, chemical tang in the air, something sharp and out of place. Fresh paint, perhaps, or cleaning fluid. Miles pressed his hand to the wood, felt it cold and unyielding, then stepped back. He circled the house, studying the windows, most shut tight, curtains drawn. Only one, high on the back wall, was open a crack, just enough for sound to escape or drift in. He made note of it, the way Bishop's ears flicked toward the faintest movement inside. He did not try to confront Arthur that day. Instinct told him to wait, to gather pieces slowly, as one assembles a puzzle in silence. Instead, he retreated, scribbling details in his notepad. The patch of fresh dirt, the toy, the page from the book, the new paint, the window left ajar. At the station, he pulled the case files once more, cross-referenced every tip, every report, every glance of suspicion. He called in a quiet favor from the city records office, requesting blueprints for the old house on Rosewood Court. The plans arrived a day later, yellowed and fragile, corners fraying. The original cellar was smaller, just a storage nook beneath the kitchen, but a permit for a foundation repair had been filed 2 years prior, approved with little scrutiny. On a hunch, Miles traced the timeline, the permit, the repairs, the stretch of weeks when Arthur's place had been a tangle of work trucks and tarps. No one had questioned it at the time. He walked the neighborhood in the evenings, slow and watchful. Each time he passed Arthur's, Bishop would tense, nose twitching, hackles barely raised. Once, as dusk settled in, the dog let out a low, guttural growl, a sound that trembled not with aggression, but warning. Back at home, Miles spread out the evidence on the kitchen table. He laid the toy and the book page beside Hazel's old drawings, careful not to let them get wet from Bishop's nose, which hovered close by, eyes intent. In that small, silent ritual, Miles felt the enormity of what was missing, the gaping space grief carves out of the world. But he also felt resolve, a steadying presence like Bishop's own, reminding him that the answers might still be close, waiting for someone to move quietly enough to notice. He reached out to the precinct psychologist, careful in his wording, describing Bishop's behavior as persistent hypervigilance around the Kellogg property, hoping it would read as clinical rather than desperate. He requested permission for a canine search, framing it as routine follow-up, and waited for the gears of bureaucracy to turn. All the while, Bishop kept his vigil. Each morning, he would take up his post at the fence line, eyes fixed on Arthur's house, body still as stone. In the quiet, Miles found himself trusting the dog's stubborn hope more than his own battered logic. There was wisdom in waiting, in listening to what the world tries so hard to hide. On the 6th day after the rain, Miles received the approval he'd requested, a warrant to conduct a more thorough search of the property, if only for the sake of procedure. As he clipped the badge to his belt, Bishop nudged his hand, warm and insistent. Outside, the sky threatened more rain. The neighborhood held its breath, as if every old hope and fear had gathered just behind the cloud cover, ready to break. And as man and dog set out, Miles with his heart pounding, Bishop with his nose to the wind, the air was alive with the silent promise that sometimes what is lost waits for the right moment to be found. The morning the search warrant was served, the sky over Missoula held a leaden stillness. Clouds pressed low, muting every color, the air thick with anticipation and the raw edge of possibility. On Rosewood Court, the world moved in hushed routines, porch lights still glowing though the sun had risen, neighbors pretending to busy themselves indoors, hearts pounding for reasons they would never say aloud. Miles stood on the sidewalk, Bishop pressed close to his side. The dog was restless, muscles taut beneath his coat, his nose twitching as he scanned the perimeter of Arthur Kellogg's weathered house. The squad car idled at the curb, its engine a distant murmur. 2 officers waited near the back gate, trying to look casual. Miles glanced at the warrant one last time, its weight both a promise and a burden. Arthur answered the door with a kind of resignation, as if he'd been expecting this moment all along. He was dressed in old wool, slippers soft from years of use, radio static leaking into the hallway behind him. His eyes, pale and rimmed with red, never met Miles's gaze. He only nodded, a single, almost imperceptible gesture, and stepped aside. "You'll find nothing here," he said quietly, his voice a gravelly hush, as if even now he wished the world would look away. Bishop slipped inside before anyone else, tail low, body tense with attention. He moved not like a dog eager to discover, but like one who already knew the gravity of what he was about to find. The interior of the house was almost obsessively neat, air tinged with the bite of cleaning chemicals and something older. Damp earth, cold stone, the faintest undercurrent of fear. Miles signaled for one officer to remain upstairs, while he and Bishop moved down the narrow, unlit stairwell toward the basement. The steps groaned beneath their weight. Bishop paused at the landing, sniffed, then barked, a sharp, urgent sound that echoed off the concrete walls. The other officer joined them, flashlight sweeping across the cluttered workbench, stacks of faded newspapers, boxes labeled in careful, looping script. Bishop moved with singular focus to a section of wall behind a heavy storage shelf. He pressed his nose to the plaster, scratched at a seam almost invisible to the eye. Miles stepped forward, running his palm along the wall, feeling for anything amiss. His fingers found a patch colder than the rest, the faint outline of a rectangle beneath his touch. He gestured to the officer. Together, they shifted the shelf aside, sending a rain of dust into the air. Behind it, a crude wooden panel, its edges splintered, painted to blend in but warped by the years. Bishop growled softly, claws scraping against the floor. Miles wedged a crowbar into the seam and with a steady pull, pried the panel loose. A rush of cold, stale air spilled out, heavy with the scent of earth and something faintly sour. Darkness yawned beyond, a crawl space just large enough for a grown man to stoop, carved into the old foundation. Miles shone his light inside. The beam danced over a heap of blankets, small boxes, the glint of metal cans. Bishop strained against the leash, ears flattened, body rigid with anticipation. In the deepest shadow, two figures huddled, silent, unmoving, eyes wide as moonstones in the sudden glare. Hazel and June. Hazel's hair fell tangled across her face, eyes rimmed with darkness. June clutched against her side, fingers tangled in the fabric of her sister's shirt. For a moment, no one moved. The silence was so complete it seemed to thicken the air. Miles's heart hammered. He crouched low, careful not to crowd them, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Hazel. June." No answer. Just wide, blinking stares, the kind of silence that spoke of years in the dark, where hope is a dangerous thing to hold. Bishop whined, gently nudging forward, then settled at the threshold, his body coiled but unmoving. Hazel stared at the dog for a long, trembling second. June began to cry, not the loud break from shattering sob of terror, but a thin, dry keening, as if the ability to wail had been worn out by too many silent nights. Miles reached out, palm open, waiting. The officers worked quietly, almost reverently. A blanket was wrapped around each girl, hands gentle, words few. As they carried the sisters from the crawl space, Bishop followed at their heels, his head lowered in solemn deference. Upstairs, the world felt too bright, too loud. Allison Reed waited in the street, hands pressed to her chest, breath caught somewhere between a scream and a prayer. When she saw the girls, pale, thin, bewildered, she fell to her knees. There were no shouts of joy, only a sound like wind keening through broken branches. Neighbors watched from their windows, tears pressed to glass, faces stricken with the joy and the sorrow of what it means to witness a miracle and to know how long it took to arrive. Paramedics came and went, their voices hushed, movements choreographed for calm. Hazel and June were wrapped in warm towels, checked for injuries, shielded from the sharpest edges of the world. Bishop lay quietly beside them, his nose pressed to Hazel's hand, a silent anchor in the storm. Arthur Kellogg was led away in handcuffs. He did not resist, nor did he explain. His eyes remained lowered, lips moving in silent patterns. Perhaps he was praying, or perhaps he was simply waiting for a silence that would never come. The house emptied, the rooms echoing with footsteps and the ghosts of 4 missing years. Outside, the first sunlight of afternoon spilled across the pavement, dazzling and indifferent. Hazel blinked up at the light, uncertain, and June buried her face against her sister's side. Allison wrapped them both in her arms, rocking gently, as if the act of holding might sew their lives back together. Bishop watched it all, his body still and solemn, the depth of his patience finally met by the return of what he never stopped searching for. Sometimes, salvation doesn't come with trumpets or cheers, but with the slow, quiet exhale of breath you've been holding for far too long. And in that hush, on that rain-washed street, hope slipped quietly back into Rosewood Court, one heartbeat at a time. There was no homecoming celebration, no banners, no balloons. The return of Hazel and June unfolded in silence, a silence so deep it swallowed every attempt at joy, leaving only the slow, painstaking process of stitching a life back together from torn, brittle cloth. The girls barely spoke. Their eyes, too large for their thin faces, held a wariness that made grown men look away. They shrank from sudden noises, flinched at the opening of doors. Hazel's hands shook when anyone reached for her, and June refused to leave her side. Fingers always clutching her sister's sleeve as if afraid the world might swallow them up again if she let go. Allison hovered, heartbroken by the distance that now yawned between her and her daughters. She slept on the floor of their room, waking at every whimper. Sometimes, in the darkest hours, she pressed her hand to their backs, just to feel the rise and fall of breath, proof, again and again, that they were really there. She offered warm baths, soft pajamas, favorite storybooks, but the old comforts landed in silence. Hazel turned pages without reading. June curled into the smallest space she could find, knees to her chest, watching Bishop's slow movements with wide, uncertain eyes. Bishop was the only one who seemed to know what to do. He never pressed, never begged for touch. Instead, he simply sat at the threshold of the girls' room, eyes soft and patient, body curled tight enough to make himself small, unthreatening. On the second night, as the rain fell soft and persistent against the window, June crept from the bed and curled against Bishop's side, burying her face in the warmth of his fur. Hazel followed, wordless. The two girls pressed close to the dog's steady presence. Bishop didn't move, didn't react. He simply stayed, an anchor in the drifting sea of their fear. Therapists came and went. Their words, gentle and rehearsed, seemed to float in the air, never quite reaching the girls. Miles sat in the next room, hands restless, listening to the murmur of voices, the uncertain quiet that followed every attempt to ask, "Can you tell me what happened?" But stories wouldn't come. The trauma had taught the girls that silence was safest. It was in this hush that healing would have to begin. In the days that followed, the rhythm of the household slowed. There was no schedule, only the gentle offerings of food, sunlight, and quiet company. Allison kept the curtains open, letting the gold of afternoon spill across the floor. Hazel watched the dust motes dance in the light, sometimes lifting her hand as if to catch one. June traced the edge of the rug with her toes, drawing invisible circles, her brow furrowed in deep concentration. Sometimes, late at night, Allison found herself on the back steps, arms wrapped tight around her knees, listening to the wind move through the bare branches. She wondered if she would ever hear her daughters laugh again. In those moments, Miles sat beside her, not with words, but with presence. They shared the quiet. Grief pressed between them like an old photograph, edges worn soft by time. Bishop remained the constant. Each morning he waited outside the girls' door until Hazel, timid but determined, crept into the hallway, one hand always on the wall. June followed, her head bowed, and together they made their slow way to the kitchen. Bishop would pause, let them pass, then follow at a respectful distance, his nails tapping softly on the worn floorboards. One morning, Hazel found her old sketchbook on the kitchen table. It had been left open to a half-finished drawing. A blue fox paused at the edge of a meadow. She stared at it for a long time, then, with a trembling hand, picked up a crayon. The line she drew was tentative, barely there, but it was the first mark she'd made since coming home. That evening, as the house settled into its quiet, June brought a picture book to Bishop and placed it by his paws. Hazel watched, then joined her, kneeling beside the dog. Together, they leaned against Bishop's warm flank, silent but present, as Allison read softly from the doorway. The story was about a lost dog who found his way home, and as Allison's voice drifted through the room, Bishop's tail thumped once, slow and steady. The weeks unfolded in fragile increments. The girls spoke little, but their silences changed, less brittle, more filled with listening. Hazel traced shapes on the window pane. June whispered to herself as she sorted buttons by color on the rug. They learned the rhythm of the house again, the creak of the front steps, the sound of Allison's humming as she cooked, the steady approach of Bishop's pause. The world outside remained a mystery, but within these walls, something small and steady was mending. Miles visited often, always in the quiet part of the afternoon, bringing small gifts, a book of animal pictures, a new set of colored pencils, a packet of sunflower seeds for Hazel. He never pressed for thanks, only sat quietly nearby, trusting that presence mattered more than words. Sometimes, he took Bishop for walks around the yard, letting the girls watch from the window until, one day, Hazel gathered her courage and followed. June soon joined, her small hand finding Bishop's fur, holding tight as they circled the garden in slow, uneven steps. The neighborhood watched, too, careful, compassionate. No one crowded the Reed house, but casseroles appeared on the porch. Flowers were left on the steps, and every light in Rosewood Court seemed to burn a little warmer, a little longer, each night. Healing, it turned out, was not a single act, but 1,000 small moments. A dog's quiet patience, a sister's steady hand. The sunlight slanting through a kitchen window. The hush after a story. The line of blue crayon drawn on an old page. It was the slow, stubborn belief that what had been broken might not be the same, but it could be made whole enough to go on. And so, in that silent season, hope was a quiet thing, threaded through every gesture, every small act of trust, every heartbeat shared in the hush before dawn. Winter held tight to Missoula. The sky remained gray, the trees bare, the river slow under a film of brittle ice. The world outside the Reed home seemed frozen, but within something subtle began to stir. Healing, Miles had come to understand, was not the absence of pain, but the willingness to stand with it, to keep showing up again and again, even when the days felt endless and the darkness thick. Hazel and June moved through their home like guests in an unfamiliar land, alert to every sound, every shift in light. They flinched at the rattle of the furnace or the scrape of a chair on tile. Most nights, nightmares drew Hazel from sleep, her cries thin and panicked, hands reaching for a comfort she wasn't sure could be trusted. June sometimes wandered the hall in the blue hours before dawn, silent, her shadow trailing across the faded rug. Allison learned to read the weather in her daughters' faces, the sudden storms of fear, the long droughts of quiet. She held them when she could, never pushing, offering the warmth of her arms, the softness of her voice, the steady thrum of her own heart. I'm here. I'm not leaving. You are safe. Some days, Hazel curled tight against her mother's side and wept for no reason she could name. Other days she drew for hours, never lifting her head, filling page after page with wild, swirling colors. Bishop remained the silent companion at the center of it all. He moved slowly now, age showing in his gait, but his presence was a balm. Hazel sometimes rested her cheek against his back, listening to the slow drum of his breathing. June brushed his fur with careful fingers, whispering secrets into his ear. On cold mornings, both girls sat pressed to his warmth, their small hands buried in his ruff, drawing courage from the patient strength of the old dog, who never turned away. Miles visited often, careful not to bring the world's noise inside. He brought books and puzzles, left them on the table with a quiet nod. Sometimes he sat with Allison in the kitchen, sharing coffee and silence, their grief and gratitude mingling in the space between words. He understood now that healing required time, long, unhurried hours of sitting with what hurt, of trusting that the ache would one day soften. Therapists came and went, each with gentle voices and hopeful tools. Some days Hazel spoke in single words. Blue, river, fox. Her voice small but sure. June, still more guarded, spoke only to Bishop, her words secret, offered up as gifts the rest of the world could not touch. Slowly, the sisters began to venture outside, first with Allison, then with Miles, and always with Bishop leading the way. Each step was a victory. Down the porch, across the frost-stiff grass, to the old maple where, years before, they'd drawn chalk stars and secret kingdoms. The town learned, too, to heal in its way. Arthur Kellogg's arrest shook Rosewood Court, a reminder of how darkness can grow, quietly, in the hearts of those no one ever really knows. When the news spread, some neighbors responded with anger, others with disbelief. But most, like Allison and Miles, felt only sorrow. Sorrow for Arthur's loneliness, for the secrets he'd carried, for all the chances missed to see, to ask, to care. The police investigation revealed that Arthur was not the architect of cruelty, but a broken link in a chain that stretched far beyond Missoula, part of a quiet, desperate world where pain begets pain, and kindness is a rare, hard-won thing. Hazel began to draw again in earnest, her pictures shifting from tangled lines and shadowy shapes to scenes of small hope. A sun over the mountains, a house beneath tall pines, Bishop curled in a patch of light. June, shy but determined, began to step further from her sister's side. One morning she walked alone to the kitchen for a glass of milk, her feet light on the cold tile. The world did not end. She came back, cheeks flushed, eyes bright with the quiet triumph of her own courage. There were setbacks, nights when fear returned with a vengeance, when Hazel sobbed for hours or June refused to speak at all. Allison sat with them, weathering each storm, holding their hands, singing old lullabies into the dark. She learned that some wounds do not close easily, but there was strength, too, in the way her daughters kept reaching for each other, kept trying, kept moving forward, however slowly. Miles watched the girls' progress with a kind of reverence. He came to understand that Bishop was more than a comfort. He was a teacher, a living lesson in patience and presence. The old dog did not rush or demand. He simply stayed, his faith unwavering. Through Bishop, Miles learned to be patient with his own grief, to let his questions settle, to accept that not all stories ended with answers. Sometimes, the gift was in the waiting, in the small acts of care repeated day after day, in the hope that flickered like a candle in a winter window. Hazel's first smile came on a quiet afternoon. She sat on the porch, Bishop's head in her lap, and watched the wind chase leaves across the yard. The smile was small, uncertain, but it was real, softening her face, lighting her eyes for the briefest moment. Allison, watching from the kitchen, pressed a hand to her mouth, tears rising unbidden. In that instant, she knew healing was possible, even if it would never be complete, even if the scars remained. Spring approached in fits and starts. The river thawed, snow retreated to the hills, and the air filled with the scent of wet earth and distant pine. In the garden, last year's sunflowers pushed stubborn shoots through the soil. Hazel and June, together with Bishop, ventured outside each morning, tracing old paths, making new ones. The shadows still lingered, but so did the promise of light. Slow, patient, always returning. And in the quiet heart of Rosewood Court, hope bloomed, fragile, persistent, growing wherever love and patience made room for it. Spring in Missoula is never sudden. It comes slow like forgiveness. The snow lingers at the edges of the river, in the deep shadows under pine, and then quietly, it is gone. The first warm breeze finds its way down Rosewood Court, lifting curtains and tugging at the pale petals in Allison's garden. There, among the violets and old stones, life stirs, not in a rush but in a slow, deliberate waking, as if the whole neighborhood must stretch and remember what it means to hope. A year has passed since Hazel and June returned home. The days have spun out. Long, patient, sometimes heavy, but full of tiny miracles. The Reed house is no longer quiet with grief. There are voices now, soft at first, tentative, like someone learning a language by listening. Hazel's laughter, thinner than before but true, floats through open windows. June's footsteps, quick, light, chase the dog's shadow across the sunlit floor. Bishop is older, slower. His muzzle is almost entirely white, his back legs stiff with age. but his eyes are bright, and he still rises every morning to sit by the door, waiting for the girls to tumble down the stairs, their hair wild and eyes bright with the promise of a new day. They never leave for school without pressing a hand to his broad head, a gesture that is both greeting and gratitude. In the afternoons, Hazel curls beside him with her sketchbook, drawing stories she is only just learning how to tell. Miles still comes by, sometimes with coffee and a book, sometimes with nothing but quiet company. He stands at the edge of the yard, watching the girls run barefoot through grass so green it seems impossible after the long Montana winter. He talks quietly with Allison, his voice lower now, shaped by the things they have shared and lost. Sometimes they sit together in silence, letting the breeze and the world's ordinary sounds fill the spaces where words cannot reach. There are scars, of course. Some you can see. Hazel's thin wrists, the sharpness of her collarbones, the way June sometimes startles at a loud sound. Others are quieter, the hush that falls when the doorbell rings, the soft closing of doors, the way both girls check the locks before bed. These are part of the story now, woven into the rhythm of the family, not as wounds, but as reminders of how fiercely they have learned to survive. The neighbors have changed too. There are more eyes on the street, more porch lights burning late into the night. The children of Rosewood Court play outside again, though their parents watch more closely now, hands poised at the edge of worry. There is a new kind of kindness in the air, gentle, unobtrusive, like casseroles left on a porch or a mailbox full of wildflowers on a hard day. That spring, Allison plants new sunflowers along the fence, their faces turned bravely toward the sky. Hazel and June help, pressing seeds into the dark earth with careful fingers, laughter tumbling out between them. Bishop sits nearby, nose lifted to the breeze, eyes half closed. For the first time in years, Hazel invites a friend from school to play. June learns to ride her bike without training wheels, her hair streaming behind her as she pedals in uneven circles around the yard. There are scraped knees, grass stains, the sweet, ordinary ache of growing. On the anniversary of their return, Allison gathers her daughters beneath the old maple tree at the end of the street. There, beside the fence, stands a new stone, small, smooth, carved with the outline of a German shepherd sitting tall and proud. It is not grand, but it is beautiful in its simplicity. Hazel brings one of her drawings and places it at the foot of the stone. Two girls holding hands, a golden dog behind them, all beneath a rising sun. The family stands together, heads bowed not in sorrow, but in memory and gratitude. Miles joins them, his hand resting quietly on Bishop's back. No one speaks. There is only the sound of wind in the branches, the chirr of birds, the heartbeat of a town that has learned to live with both sorrow and hope. Time passes. The wounds do not vanish, but they become softer at the edges, like river stones shaped by years of water and care. In the gentle hush of early evening, Hazel sometimes draws at the kitchen table while June leans against Bishop, humming a song with no words. Allison watches them, her hands busy with dinner, her heart full of the complicated, beautiful ache of loving what remains. On the last day of school, the girls run home together, cheeks flushed and arms full of wildflowers. They burst through the door, laughter echoing through every room, and for a moment, the house is filled with sunlight. Bishop rises, slow but eager, tail thumping against the floor as he greets his family, each one touched, changed, and made stronger by the journey they have shared. Evenings fall soft and golden on Rosewood Court. Porch lights glow. Doors are left open to the breeze. And in the yard, beneath the sunflowers and the shadow of the old maple, the girls play. Sometimes quietly, sometimes with wild abandon, always with Bishop nearby. There will always be scars. There will always be shadows. But in this place, this battered, beautiful corner of the world, there is also the enduring miracle of ordinary love, the stubborn hope that rises with every new dawn, and the quiet, steady presence of a dog who taught them all what it means to stay. Sometimes the hardest journeys are not the ones that take us far from home, but the ones that bring us back to ourselves, changed, marked, yet somehow more whole. In the quiet courage of a mother's love, the unwavering loyalty of a dog who waited through every season, and the slow, fragile trust of two children finding sunlight again, we see that healing does not mean forgetting. It means carrying our scars gently and choosing every day to keep loving, even when the world has changed. If this story touched you or reminded you of someone you love, I hope you'll share your thoughts below. Have you known a moment when hope seemed out of reach, yet something, a small kindness, a faithful friend, helped you find your way back to the light? We invite you to share your story, or simply let us know what this journey meant to you. Your words might be the gentle encouragement someone else needs tonight. Thank you for listening, for caring, and for being part of a community where even quiet miracles matter.